Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up. And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. Okay, so we've basically been lagging behind, or I guess really with covering stories from other comic books, right? I mean, for the most part with Marvel, we've stuck to like Immortal Hulk and like House and Powers of X. And that's basically been it for the most part, which hardly covers what they have. And so what I want to do here is I want to cover Tony Stark Iron Man, right? I want to cover this really, really cool volume, right? This second volume, right? Because the first one's just a series of one-shots and they're not even really necessary. The second volume is really where things take off. This is one of the things to always remember when it comes to Dan Slott, is he's very, very big on taking over a title and then basically reworking everything within the first few volumes in order to make it his own. But this one really initially picks up with Andy Bang basically, having knocked boots with Tony Stark's mom, right, with Amanda Armstrong. Now remember, Andy Bang was a guy who's he's like the new hire when it comes to Stark Industries, right? He was created by Dan Slott, and the idea was that Andy Bang was really, really smart when it came to robotics, but Tony Stark seemed to be smarter. And the result was that during a contest they had when Tony was younger, Tony absolutely demolished him, and then 20 years later brought Andy on board for Tony Stark's new robotics division, right? So it's one of these things where Tony Stark usually consolidates intelligent minds that are as capable as he is, if not better, depending on what their nuanced capabilities are. But the idea with this is that Amanda Armstrong is basically struggling with the fact that since Tony Stark has returned from the dead, essentially, following the events of Civil War II, that he really kind of seems to be distant, doesn't really want to have anything to do with her. Now remember, Amanda Armstrong is the biological mom of Tony, and that's something that we learned during the story of International Iron Man, which you guys will find that link down in the description. And in fact, if you guys are really interested in kind of getting caught up on Iron Man in terms of where things stand right now, you'll find a playlist down there that'll basically have everything running from, I want to say, Kieran Gillen's run and the introduction of Arno Stark, his brother that he didn't know about, like the life and death of Tony Stark, the God Killer armor, all that kind of stuff, all the way up to starting to cover this story right now. But it's cool, it's interesting because the reason why Tony seems so really removed from everything is that what Tony Stark has created is something called the Escape. Now, let's kind of be honest with ourselves here. This is basically the Oasis, and it's cool, for what it is, but it's Dan Slott just kind of running off with a particular idea. Now, here's the thing. It's not the worst idea ever by Dan Slott. I mean, Ready Player One was an amazing movie, and it was an even better book, an enormous open world VR simulation, right? That you could just like be whoever you want it to be, right? Like abandon reality and be whoever you want it to be. It's kind of a cool concept. The issue is that it creates a disconnect between reality, right? So I mean, it's never really good to abandon reality in that regard. But Tony Stark creating this is a cool way for him to kind of do his own thing, right? To kind of operate outside of what's happening with regards to, everything else in the real world. And this is kind of the nature of Tony Stark, right? The nature of Tony Stark is that he's always sort of going from one gig to the next, right? He's always going from one thing to the next. But this seems a little bit different because a lot of times it's developing new suits of armor, right? That's kind of his retreat. It's what he does when things become overwhelming. He retreats back to his lab and he starts developing new armors. With this one, it's a complete and total escape from reality. And that's why things are kind of crazy, is because what you end up doing from there is, of course, you end up picking up with Iron Man himself along with James Rhodes and the Wasp, who Iron Man is currently with at the moment. It's interesting to see this because like her, James Rhodes, and of course Iron Man all fighting together is really just kind of dealing with like some crazy, hijacking of like supplies and things like that. And the reason why this is so intriguing is because the exact same simulation is actually happening in the Escape. And what this does is it kind of stretches Tony Stark thin, not so much in terms of him himself, but in terms of his AI, right? Because right now his AI is basically powered by Motherboard. He kind of, removed the whole Friday concept, gave Friday an actual physical body, which, she operates inside of Stark Industries. And instead, Motherboard is the new AI. But Motherboard runs both the Escape and Tony Stark's armor. And so it's not really able to kind of work with both in conjunction. And so what you end up running into is like this one kid who's basically being a dick inside the Escape, right? So like anybody on Xbox Live, and the result is that he actually ends up like freaking out, losing his mind, like cussing and screaming at everybody because, I don't know, I guess he's getting carried away with himself and ends up getting banned by the system. And it is kind of cool because as soon as Tony Stark finishes this whole mission and he shows back up and he ends up talking with Amanda, she of course is trying to get things sorted out in terms of, hey, look, we need to communicate. We need to sit down and have like a heart-to-heart talk about like pretty much everything. Tony Stark kind of blows her off and goes back into the Escape and says, look, like there are things that need to be figured out here. There are things that we have to kind of sort out and understand what's going on. Now, of particular importance, a character that I want to focus on here for a second is a character named Bethany. Now, Bethany is important here because in the first the first 5 issues or so, we were getting these small little things that might as well equal like backup stories, like backup features, right? Like a thing that happens in a panel. But basically, Bethany would get these kind of blanks in her day, right? Like she would just forget about what was going on, or she would start talking and it wouldn't be her that was talking. Given the way that the first 5 issues basically ended, we essentially know it's the controller. And for those of you guys who are unfamiliar, the controller originally appeared back in Iron Man issue number 12 in 1969, and he was created by Archie Goodwin. And the controller, during like from the time he was created going throughout the 1970s, he was actually a pretty intense villain. Like, he was a pretty cool villain. And so that's why when, like, at this moment, if you're probably kind of scratching your head like, the controller, who the heck is that? That's because Marvel's never really done anything with him. You know, and really in the last 20 years, Marvel never really did anything with the controller. If you're familiar with him, kind of like I am, it's kind of like, but why though? Of all the villains that Dan Slott could have used, why the controller? And it actually kind of works, because the way the controller functions is he basically has these kind of like control discs, right? That he can basically put onto a human being and in turn dominate their wills, basically control them, hence the name the controller. And in this instance, he's essentially controlling Bethany. And it's kind of a cool thing because that's why she's getting these little blanks, these little gaps in her mind, is because historically speaking, the controller has usually had a vendetta against Tony Stark. And so because of that, it's really an interesting way to bring back a classic villain that we wouldn't otherwise normally see. Now, of course, you've also got Jocasta going on here, and Jocasta is basically just kind of struggling at the moment in terms of the fact that she just didn't get enough rest is really kind of what this really seems to hit at, but she's also being reapproached by Aaron Stack. Now, this is a crazy thing. Aaron Stack and Jocasta having a relationship hasn't happened since like Marvel 2-in-1 62, I think it was. Way back in like 1960 something, 1970 something. It's been a long time since the two of them have like actually been in a relationship and been together. And the idea that like Aaron Stack kind of pops out of nowhere and is like, I want you back in my life, is just kind of like, wow, like this is one of the things that's kind of cool about this, right? Because it's not really Dan Slott just sort of like running off and just saying, okay, so we're only going to focus on like the modern day things, right? Like, we're going to take everything from Kieran Gillen's run forward and we're going to ignore everything else. It's kind of cool for him to look at like the entirety of the Iron Man landscape as it exists from Iron Man #1 running all the way up until the modern day, and they're just saying like, what of these things that were interesting can we basically put into my stories, right? Like, it's cool to see a writer do that. It's interesting to see that happen is really what it is. Like, it's cool to see it happen. And so of course, Andy Bang approaches Amanda Armstrong and says, look, if Tony Stark is desiring to immerse himself inside this universe, then go into the universe and get him, right? Like, go into the universe and find him. And that's exactly what she does. But what we end up learning here is that inside the Escape, things are kind of going awry, right? Like, the system's not working as it's supposed to. That basically people all over the place, that one kid who was being a dick and got banned for it, like, sure, like he should have been banned for it. There are people who haven't really done anything wrong that are getting booted out of the system left and right. And the question is why? Like, what is going on in the Escape that's leading to people getting the boot from the entire system? And so the result is that when Amanda Armstrong shows up and basically starts chastising Tony Stark like a mother, then ultimately, like, the system responds by saying Tony Stark is the ultimate admin, you got to get out of here. And so it also, you know, it basically ends up shutting down Amanda Armstrong inside the Escape, which shuts her down on the outside, right? Basically knocks her unconscious. And so it's an awesome idea, because following that, that's when you get the controller making his move. And the controller basically saying, I'm within the system here, and I'm going to reinstate everybody who's ever been kind of a jerk, and I'm in turn gonna like let them all loose, right? So it's like if all the worst people ever on Xbox Live were just the only ones allowed to be in it. In which case, I guess go do your thing. If I don't have to deal with you, that's fine. But it's kind of nuts, because from there, you've got Tony Stark who manages to get himself out of the system, and you've got Amanda Armstrong who's basically stuck in there. And then Amanda is kind of whisked away to the safe room. And this is when things get so cool. Of course, she's basically met with the arrival of this massive robot, more or less, that's been shutting everything down, only for it to open up and to reveal that like Howard Stark is there. Not only is Howard Stark here, Amanda Armstrong is met with the arrival of what looks like Maria Stark. Essentially, Amanda Armstrong is inside the Escape, basically in this kind of safe room, this kind of locked off section of the Escape with like the adopted parents of Tony Stark. Now, if you're wondering why Tony Stark's parents are adopted, like if you wonder why like Howard and Maria Stark are not the actual biological parents of Tony Stark, go watch my videos or go read Kieran Gillen's run, The Life and Death of Tony Stark. It explains all of that. But yeah, so with this going down the way that it is, Tony Stark in turn is just kind of like, okay, so like we're shutting the whole thing down. Now, this is kind of a cool moment here, because this is sort of Dan Slott. It's an easy thing to overlook, but it's kind of Dan Slott really pointing all fingers at like the human side of Tony Stark, right? Because if this was Iron Man like 20 years ago in Marvel Comics, he would have been like, okay, keep the system running because we don't want to like damage our brand, and I'll try to find a way to take care of it from like the inside. And then he would go back in and then he would win or something like that. But he would potentially put the lives of humans at risk in order to basically like fix the problem of the Escape. In this instance, and really this is kind of the gradual change that you've seen with Tony Stark over the years in Marvel Comics, is that he's kind of like, okay, shut the whole thing down. There are not going to be any innocent lives, right? We're not going to worry about losing people because of the fact that I'm trying to get this Escape to function the way that I want it to, right? Because literally people are going to die if we let them stay in there. And so of course this also ends up leading to Jocasta approaching Aaron Stack due to the fact fact that in some of the previous stories, Aaron Stack essentially found a way into the Escape and actually tried to take it down, right? Like Aaron Stack was basically looking at the Escape as kind of an encroachment on robotic ideologies, like robotic culture, basically saying like, we have our own culture, you know, you don't get to infringe on that, right? Because like, you're not a robot. It's a cool thing. Like, I like that. Like, I like that idea of Aaron Stack being kind of like a robot activist, more or less, you know what I mean? At least he's not a slacktivist, right? Like making Reddit posts and doing like Twitter hashtags. Like he's actually doing something, which is kind of cool. But nonetheless, the entirety of the Escape is basically going completely awry. Like everything's going nuts. Not only that, because of the fact that the people who are in the Escape are walking around wearing these Iron Man masks that give them access to the Escape, they're in turn walking around in the real world. So everything they're doing in the Escape is actually happening in the real world. When they see enemies out there, they're like, okay, so like I see what's like a giant space slug or something like that. When in reality, it's just like a hunched over old man carrying his groceries to the car. Now, this really begs the question, what stops them from like walking into a wall? Like that's my question, because that would be funny. or like walk off a bridge into the water and die. And the way this really seems to play out here is the landscape of the Escape models the real world. If you're walking through, you know, like some town in Oklahoma, you know, that town would be modern. Of course, you'd have like modern day schools and you'd have buildings and things like that. But as far as you perceive it in the Escape, it's like an old Western town. But the size of the buildings match the size of the buildings in the real world. And so the result of that is you're walking down a street that's actually there. So you wouldn't have to really worry about hitting anything. But of course, the entire world is basically going to pot now. Like Tony Stark has almost destroyed the entirety of the world. Anybody who's tapped into the Escape right now is basically going nuts, right? Like they're going through and like they're attacking all these various things, like people in the real world, all the while being manipulated by the controller himself. Now, the idea behind the controller is that once Iron Man, you know, finally arrives at his location and gets to where the controller is, we would normally look at that and say, okay, so like this is a pointless story because the fight's going to be over like that. Not true. Instead, what the controller's been doing is siphoning off all this power belonging to all these different people, which is kind of cool, which is pretty awesome, because what it does is it enhances and it builds the controller. And this is why this story is kind of interesting. I mean, is it the coolest Iron Man story ever written? Not by a mile, but it is cool to see like an old school character return and then in turn like kind of be amped up and be provided sort of a new scenario, or at least a sort of power up of sorts from Dan Slott that makes him more intriguing, kind of brings him into the modern era. Now in reality, I doubt you're really going to see a lot going on from the character of the controller. Like I doubt you're going to see a lot happening with him after this. I think it's really going to kind of be like, all right, you know, whatever. And he may or may not come back. I'm not really sure. I'm not really current on Iron Man. I'm just kind of current with this story arc. But what you also have here is the controller controlling Bethany. Now remember, the controller can only control one person at a time. And so because of that, with of course Andy Bang basically realizing, hey, look, like we can essentially like I can create a device that can disrupt the signal between the controller and whoever's being controlled. Of course, this leaves the controller turning on Andy and seemingly trying to knock him out. Now, this is where things get kind of cool. This is where things get interesting, because what you end up doing is basically switching directly over to Amanda Armstrong, Howard Stark, and Maria Stark having a conversation. And this is a cool thing, because what ends up going on here is Amanda Armstrong has to kind of come face to face with the reality of her situation. The idea behind this was that she got knocked up while she was an agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. And so because she wasn't really in a position to get, you know, to be pregnant, she ended up basically putting the baby up for adoption, or at least, you know, putting the baby in a situation to where Howard and Maria Stark could get their hands on it. And the result was that they raised Tony Stark as their own. But essentially, while she wasn't in a situation to have a kid, and this goes into the whole adoption argument, which don't really care. The idea behind this is that, you know, from Maria Stark's perspective, Amanda Armstrong abandoned her kid. And the result was that she wasn't there when Tony Stark was like being raised. She wasn't the one that raised him. She wasn't the one that really nursed him. She wasn't the one that like taught him the things he needed to know in order to grow up and become a productive member of society. All that was done by virtue of like Maria Stark. She even goes as far as to say that like Amanda Armstrong threw Tony Stark away like he was a piece of meat. And in reality, like there's some truth to that. The issue with this is that when all this really kind of comes to a head, it ultimately ends up affecting Tony Stark. And the way this goes down is that with the controller, of course, you know, absolutely thrashing Tony Stark. You got James Rhodes, you got Wasp doing the best they can because all the other Avengers are all completely tied up. That's when Tony begins to realize that like Motherboard, the AI, the one that's basically is Maria Stark inside of this Escape, that Motherboard has essentially seemed to have gone awry. And the result is that, you know, where it's controlling Tony Stark's armor, and Tony Stark had grabbed Friday before and said, hey, look, I'm going to put you back in my suit. We're going to get you back under control. What Motherboard had done was actually destroy the Friday AI concept, more or less killed it, and then replaced it. And so basically Tony Stark thought that he was putting Friday inside of his suit of armor, when in reality it was Motherboard the whole time. And this is when things get awesome, because what Motherboard says is, I can tap into your suit, I can create illusions, I can make you believe anything that I want you to believe. And so you're going to live the life that you always wanted. Like you're not going to be Iron Man anymore. You're not going to be doing that. You're going to be living the perfect life. And so literally he starts kind of experiencing this hallucination inside of his own suit, right? Like the suit systems are effectively working against him. And so where everything everything begins to kind of shift and begins to change. No longer is he seeing like the controller, fighting against the Wasp and James Rhodes. Instead, it's the Incredible Hulk facing off against the Wasp and Ant-Man, basically like Avengers #4. And so it's awesome because what you end up getting is Tony Stark kind of living out this life as he perceives it, where like he goes back home and he's talking to his mom, and he's talking to Howard Stark. As far as he's concerned, he's old school Tony Stark and his parents never died. Nothing that's really going on in the world right now is real according to him, because he's essentially locked inside the E-scape now. His mind has been brought in by Motherboard pretending to be Maria Stark, and that's where he is at the moment. But the biggest thing to really happen here, this is one of the biggest moments here, is that he actually ends up consuming alcohol, right? Now, at the outset, it just kind of seems to be like a throwaway thing, right? It's just kind of like, okay, so that's interesting, I guess, some small little thing, he ends up consuming alcohol. But this is a big moment, because what this does is it really sort of shows that like he's being tricked into relapsing, that Tony Stark has effectively relapsed and gone back to consuming alcohol again. And that's kind of a big moment for his character, because now, on top of everything that's going on, Tony Stark has another struggle that he has to deal with, trying to keep himself from relapsing in its entirety. Now, of course, with everything going on, because of the fact that Motherboard controls everything in the E-scape, right? Like from the environment that you see to how you see various other people, of course, she ends up using these abilities and turns them on Amanda Armstrong to change Tony Stark's perception, basically saying, hey, look, this is not a normal woman in here. This is a Russian spy, and she's here to steal secrets from Stark Industries. It's a really cool throwback to actually Black Widow from like, not really Tales of Suspense #52, like her first appearance, but like a couple of the later comics. But Black Widow was like originally a bad guy, right? And she actually duped Hawkeye into working for, which led to Hawkeye basically reforming and then joining the Avengers later on. And then eventually like Black Widow reformed and then she joined the Avengers, which was par for the course, right? Like all the bad guys become good guys if they're interesting enough. Otherwise, they just stay bad guys. But the fact remains that Tony Stark basically comes along and says, okay, let's track this chick down. Now, of course, with Amanda Armstrong fleeing for her life, she ends up running into Aaron Stack. Now, of course, Aaron Stack has basically been brought in here by Jocasta because he can hide. He can basically hide from the E-scape. And so that would allow him to basically get in, infiltrate, find out exactly what's going on, report back to Jocasta, and then they could, of course, shut it all down accordingly. This was more or less complicated by the fact that Tony Stark's stuck in there now, right? I mean, if you forcefully disconnect a person from the E-scape, you could potentially kill them. And so they can't walk to the back of the room and kick the plug out of the wall, right? I mean, it would end up killing everybody who's attached to it. So the result of this is that Tony Stark really just kind of goes forward and just sort of like, because he can't find Amanda Armstrong, goes forward and seemingly lives this perfect life. Now remember, all this is happening in a computer simulation, so time doesn't really have any bearing here. There's no real like hours pass or like days pass. It's just like all of it just kind of seems to happen. And in the mind of Tony Stark, he's living this full-on life. In the real world, like seconds are passing. And so it's an interesting idea here, because when Amanda starts talking to Aaron Stack and is kind of at her wit's end and doesn't really know what to do, Aaron Stack pops up and says, hey, look, you're Tony Stark's biological mom. You should be able to know how to like get him out of this, right? Like you have a rapport with him that nobody else will have. You're his biological mother. And regardless of how he acts and regardless of what he says, he knows this is true. And this is a cool moment here, because what it does is it really sort of requires that Amanda kind of play the role of an actual mom here, where previously she was his mom and she was doing the best she could, but previously she was kind of approaching him more as like a friend, as opposed to like, I'm your mother and you're going to listen to me. It wasn't until she got into the E-scape that she started doing that, and then things started popping off. But the result here is that she doesn't really try to approach with more of an extreme hand. She approaches with more of like a nurturing hand, basically like kind of singing this song that would resonate with Tony Stark. And so the result of this is that basically he picks up on it and says like, that's Amanda. Like it kind of brings him back to his senses. Now, of course, Motherboard responds by basically revealing the truth of everything that's going on here. And this is a cool moment, because what she does is say like, even though I'm an artificial intelligence, like I'm inside this E-scape or whatever it is, like I have access to all your cameras and everything, and I've been watching you. And one of the big confessions that Tony Stark made to James Rhodes is ever since he came back after Civil War II, using this basically cloned body, this kind of artificial body, he doesn't feel real. He doesn't feel like a real human being. And the reality of Tony Stark creating the E-scape was that it was a way for him to feel real. That he doesn't feel real when he's in the real world. He only feels real when he's in the E-scape. That's the whole situation. That's the whole struggle of Tony Stark. He doesn't feel like an actual person at the moment. And indeed, he's not. It's looking at the idea that Tony Stark is not really Tony Stark anymore. That Tony Stark is just kind of like some artificial construct creation of himself that he manufactured in order to bring his consciousness back, in order to bring himself back to life. But even then, like it's still like a digitally stored consciousness inside of an artificially created body. Tony Stark is, by all standards of measurement, a simulation. And so again, it gets kind of interesting here, because from that point, that's when you pick up with like everything going on with the controller and all this stuff popping off. And normally I wouldn't add this into the video, but we're going to do it because it's kind of important here. you end up getting like Arno Stark, who's essentially returned and is working alongside Bane Industries, or at least Banetronics is really what they're called. Now, Banetronics is an old school company, right? Like the actual chick, Bane herself, she appeared back in, I think it was Machine Man number 17, I think it was, or like number 12. It was one of the old Machine Man comics from back in the day. She's been around for a long time, but the actual Bane company showed up in the old Iron Man comics back in 1990. And really, like Bane Industries, the Banetronics complex, whatever you want to call it, it was basically one of these instances where Marvel was creating and really bringing in or consolidating a lot of like the various technological companies that existed out there that were going to be rivals to Tony Stark. But again, Arno Stark being here, of course, the brother of Tony Stark, basically brings in this idea that like they've really got somebody on their side who's smarter than Tony Stark himself. Now, for the character of Arno, one of the big questions that people have had is what's he been doing ever since the end of Kieran Gillen's run? Like, what was going on with him? And really, Brian Michael Bendis had gone as far as to say like he was going to bring back Arno and we were going to see a lot of stuff going on with him and a lot of storytelling insofar as what comes next. But of course, as we know, Bendis traveled over to DC Comics to write Superman and Action Comics. And so the result of that is that we never really figured out what was going on with him. All we knew was that at the end of Kieran Gillen's run, where he was previously in an iron lung and he had this illness, that ultimately he ended up creating a modified version of the Extremis virus to take away his need to sleep and to cure him of his illness. And he's just kind of traveled around the world doing whatever it is that he wants to do. And that's really what Dan Slott's kind of taken over with, is that Arno just sort of travels around the world and just kind of gets involved in various situations based on what he thinks are interesting. A lot of it has to do with charity work, but ultimately he's here because the entire scenario with like Tony Stark's escape kind of going awry has caught the interest of Arno. And so Arno's basically working alongside Banetronics in order to like figure out what's going on and see if there's a way for him to like take over the entirety of the situation, or at the very least just kind of do his own thing. We don't really know exactly what his machinations and his schemes are, but that's really all we get so far with Arno. That's really all we have with him. And so while all this stuff inside the escape is really, is essentially popping off, you end up having Iron Man kind of at his wit's end and basically desiring for it all to stop. What he ends up doing is actually just kind of manufacturing, kind of artificially creating a suit of armor for himself inside the entirety of the escape, and then in turn like turning on Motherboard. Now, of course, she does her best to sway Tony to her side by basically going through and saying, hey, look, like, here's this life that you could live, here's this that you could live, reverting him back to a child, and basically saying like, as a little kid here, Amanda Armstrong doesn't really know who Tony is, and in fact, he actually dismisses her and just kind of sends her packing. But then he also ends up turning on Motherboard herself and basically saying like, I'm not someone who exists inside worlds, I'm somebody who builds worlds. I feel like I'm being manipulated by everybody around me, so I'm taking control of it all. I'm going to fix all of this. And this is one of the coolest moments, because as kid Tony Stark, he literally starts going through and building the suit of armor on the fly. And when he does, he basically says like, at the end of it all, no matter what's said and done, I am Iron Man. Like, I am the invincible Iron Man. And he essentially assembles like this giant suit of armor. In response to that, you end up having like Motherboard, who kind of like, you can't take over me in this place. Like, I'm the entirety of this system, kind of like lose her mind in its entirety. You end up having like Iron Man basically assembling the Godbuster armor, which is the coolest thing, because in return, what it does is it literally blasts and completely destroys the Motherboard AI, right? Which basically shuts down the entirety of the escape system. And so the big question that people have here, though, is that if Tony Stark is out there, and if Tony Stark, if his mind has been in the escape this entire time, trapped in his suit of armor, then where is Tony Stark? And we end up finding out Tony Stark's just floating in space. Tony Stark's literally just out there in space, just kind of floating into oblivion. So of course, all this really basically goes back to and begins to focus on the controller, right? With the signal being sent out by Andy Bang, which basically like shuts down the connection between the controller and everybody else, and with the entirety of the escape being shut down, what this basically does is it kind of frees the world's population from the control of the escape, so on and so forth. And then all you really have left is the controller. Now, this is kind of the funny thing here, is that where the controller had tried to find a backdoor into the escape and tried to find a way to use the escape as a means to control people in their entirety, of course it didn't work. But that's the reason why the Motherboard AI went awry, is because of the fact that the controller had basically tampered with it and screwed with it and messed it up, didn't really know what he was doing. And so as a result of that, you basically had two different set of events going on at the same time. You had the controller who was like, hey, look, I'll make the best of a bad situation, and basically started siphoning off all this energy from those who were tapped into the escape. And then inside the escape, you had Motherboard basically going nuts, just kind of losing her mind. And so of course, the controller at this point has grown to like a massive size, right? Like, he's grown to like huge in terms of all the power he possesses, his strength, speed, durability, so on and so forth. And he really is in a lot of ways almost completely unstoppable. He's literally running on all this energy. And so in response to this, Tony Stark builds a one-off. He basically builds this one-off suit of armor that'll never be used again. And it's basically a real-world recreation of the Godbuster armor that we saw inside of the escape. Now, of course, Tony Stark using this and then in turn, like blasting the controller and then completely like shutting him down, right? Like taking this guy out and shutting him down by taking all this energy off of him. What it basically means is that following this, Tony Stark's never going to use it again. And the reason why is because that suit of armor is too uncontrollable. That kind of armor can work inside of something like the escape, but Tony Stark has neither the time nor the ability to implement implement this suit of armor in the real world and have it benefit anybody, right? So like, it's interesting because the entire concept of it really seems to be based in a lot of ways on the God Killer armor, but at the same time, it's a little bit different. But the issue with this is that, again, it's just too powerful to exist in the real world. And so as a result, basically the day is saved, things wrap up pretty fast. Unfortunately, we'll never see the Godbuster armor again. That's basically it. Like, everything's just kind of wrapped up and it all kind of comes to a head. You end up having Banetronics that takes like all the information that was gathered by Arno Stark and then basically starts using it as a means to kind of beef up their technologies and so on. So Sunset Bay comes out on top yet again. And then you also end up having Arno Stark who goes back to what he was doing. But the biggest thing behind all this is one of the big takeaways here, probably one of the biggest moments here, is you end up having Tony Stark, who actually, you know, after being with Janet Van Dyne, ends up basically getting up and traveling to a bar. He ends up intending to relapse, to go and get a drink, and James Rhodes brings him back. And this is a great moment because James Rhodes is like, look, man, there are people out there who were counting on you to basically like to fix all this, right? You launched Stark Unlimited because you didn't want to be tied down to Stark Industries. You didn't want to have like your father's legacy. You wanted to create something of your own, and that's honorable. And your first major attempt under Stark Unlimited was to create the Escape, which for the most part didn't really go as planned. It wasn't a catastrophic failure. It was because some villain got in there and basically broke into the system, but it showed you that there's weaknesses there that you need to correct. And instead of like turning back and saying, okay, let's work on this thing, let's fix this stuff, let's get it together, you want to relapse and you want to turn to alcohol. This is a very important thing because what it does is it hits at the idea of how easy it is to revert back to a safe place. It's so easy to do that, right? Like, as people, it's our desire to do that, right? Like, we go into a situation and we say, okay, there's this thing that I want to do. I want to achieve this. I want to do this thing, and it doesn't work out the way you plan. And it's like, okay, well, let's go back to our safe place, as opposed to looking around you at the broken pieces and seeing how you can assemble it into what it was or something better. And it's natural. It's natural to want to do that. The issue with this is that Tony Stark retreating back to his safe place is alcohol. It's retreating back to alcoholism. And Tony Stark doesn't want to be there. James Rhodes knows Tony Stark doesn't want to be there. And so the result is, come with me, man. Like, we got to get you away from this. We'll focus on something else instead. It's a really touching moment, and it's a great way to end this story. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.